The notification arrived without ceremony. A stark, formal letter slipped beneath the door of Marcus's flat. He found it hours later, a pale rectangle against the worn parquet, a minor intrusion on his meticulously ordered existence. Marcus, a historian by trade and temperament, preferred the quiet company of forgotten archives and the precise weight of ancient facts to the unpredictable chaos of human interaction. His current project, a comprehensive analysis of 17th century agricultural reforms, demanded absolute focus. The letter, however, insisted on attention. It was from a solicitor, a Mr. Alistair Finch, informing Marcus of the unexpected demise of a distant relative he barely remembered, a great-aunt named Alara Vance. The accompanying details were brief, almost terse, but the core message was unmistakable. Marcus was the sole inheritor of Blackwood Manor. He read the words again, a faint frown creasing his brow. Blackwood Manor. The name resonated with a faint, unpleasant echo from childhood whispers, dismissed then as now as provincial fabrication. He knew it existed. A sprawling, isolated property in a remote corner of the county, but its reputation as a place of ill fortune, a repository of inexplicable occurrences, had always struck him as the purest form of rural superstition. Marcus dealt in verifiable data, in the dusty tangibility of primary sources. Ghosts and curses were the domain of credulous minds, not serious academics. A week later, his own vehicle deemed unsuitable for the journey into the sparsely populated moorlands, Marcus sat in the passenger seat of a hired car. The driver, a taciturn man with a perpetually furrowed brow, navigated the increasingly narrow, overgrown lanes. The landscape shifted from cultivated fields to wild, untamed stretches of gorse and heather. The sky, a bruised purple-gray, pressed low, threatening rain. The air grew heavier, thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying vegetation. They passed through a village so small it barely registered, a cluster of gray stone cottages clinging to a single winding street. A solitary, dilapidated structure stood at the edge of the village, its ornate facade crumbling, posters from forgotten films peeling from its boarded-up entrance. An old cinema, the driver grunted, pointing with a calloused thumb. Used to be something. Now, nothing but a skeleton. Marcus merely nodded, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. The driver's words, though innocuous, settled like a fine dust on his thoughts. A premonition of decay. The car finally turned off the main track onto a barely discernible private drive. Trees, their branches skeletal against the oppressive sky, closed in immediately, forming a tunnel of gnarled wood. The air grew still, the only sound the crunch of tires on gravel. Marcus felt a subtle shift in the atmosphere, a drop in temperature, a vague pressure against his eardrums. He attributed it to the change in elevation, the sudden density of the trees. Then, through a break in the foliage, Blackwood Manor emerged. Ivy, thick as a man's arm, clawed its way up the walls, a verdant, suffocating embrace. The scale of the place was immense, overwhelming. It didn't look merely old, it looked ancient, a relic not just of a bygone era, but of a different, harsher world. A low, guttural groan of rusted iron announced their arrival as the car pulled to a halt before a massive wrought iron gate. The driver killed the engine. Silence descended, profound and absolute, broken only by the whisper of the wind through the unseen eaves of the manor. Marcus detected a faint, metallic tang in the air, like old blood, or perhaps just the accumulated rust of ages. Looks like it hasn't seen a soul in decades, the driver observed, his voice hushed. Marcus merely stared. He felt a sudden, inexplicable urge to instruct the driver to turn around, to drive his back to the world of concrete facts and verifiable truths. But his determination, the stubborn resolve of a man who pursued knowledge relentlessly, asserted itself. This was his inheritance. He would examine it, catalog it, and then, presumably, dispose of it. He stepped out of the car, the gravel sharp beneath his polished shoes. A heavy chain, corroded and thick, secured it. It was the solicitor, Mr. Finch, a diminutive man bundled in a thick overcoat, his breath pluming in the frigid air. As Mr. Finch unlatched the gate, the groan of the metal was protracted, a mournful sound that seemed to emanate from the very fabric of the house itself. Marcus stepped through, onto the overgrown path. The solicitor's assistant, a young woman whose efficiency bordered on the robotic, had handed Marcus a weighty brass key. "The estate grounds are extensive, sir. The manor itself, well, it requires attention." His tone had been neutral, but Marcus detected a faint undercurrent of something less professional, something like apprehension. He had dismissed it as a reflection of the manor's local reputation, a mere vestige of rural superstition. Now, standing in the cavernous main hall, Marcus felt the truth of his words. The air was thick with the scent of aged timber and disuse, a musty sweetness clinging to the tapestries and the dust-shrouded furniture. Sunlight, fractured by grimy leaded panes, cast shifting patterns on the polished but scarred floorboards. He ran a gloved hand over a massive oak newel post, its surface surprisingly smooth beneath the grime. The silence here was not the quiet of his flat. It was a deep, resonant hush, as if the very walls absorbed sound, holding their breath. His initial task was clear: establish a base of operations. He chose the former library, a vast room lined with empty shelves, its grand fireplace choked with soot. Here, he could unpack the dozens of archival boxes that had been transported from his flat. This was his element: the systematic organization of information, the meticulous reconstruction of the past. He began with his historical texts, arranging them by period and subject, his movements precise and economical. The physical exertion was a welcome counterpoint to the mental demands of his research. As the days bled into one another, Marcus settled into a routine. He rose with the weak dawn, consumed a Spartan breakfast, and descended to the library, where he would work until dusk, surrounded by the comforting scent of old paper and the quiet rustle of turning pages. He was determined to unravel the manor's history, to strip away the layers of local folklore and uncover the verifiable facts. The first anomaly occurred during his third afternoon. He was cross-referencing a land deed from the late 17th century when a sudden, precise chill cut through the stale air, clinging to his left arm. It was not a draft. The room was sealed. He paused, his pen hovering over the parchment, and glanced around. The temperature in the rest of the room remained constant. He attributed it to an isolated pocket of cold air, perhaps from a structural fault, and continued his work. Later that week, while researching the manor's architectural evolution, he heard it. A faint, sibilant sigh, like dry leaves skittering across stone, emanating from the hallway just outside the library door. He straightened, his brow furrowed. The sound was too indistinct to identify, too fleeting to analyze. An old house, he reasoned, settled. Wood contracted. Wind whistled through unseen gaps. The misplacements began subtly. One morning, his spectacles, which he had meticulously placed beside his research notes, were found on a different shelf, nestled between two volumes on medieval agricultural practices. He frowned. He was a creature of habit, fastidious in his organization. Perhaps, he mused, the estate worker who had brought his boxes in had inadvertently shifted them. He made a mental note to confirm the next time he saw the worker, though he hadn't seen anyone since the initial delivery. Another instance. A heavy brass letter opener, left on the ledger, was later discovered resting precisely on the mantelpiece above the fireplace. Marcus examined it, then the ledger. No sign of disturbance. He pinched the bridge of his nose. He was tired, perhaps. The extensive research, the change of environment. It could be affecting his short-term recall, leading to minor lapses. He rationalized each occurrence, meticulously filing away the logical explanations, refusing to entertain any alternative. He was a man of evidence, of tangible proof. The solicitor's assistant had mentioned several outbuildings, mostly derelict. He followed a crumbling flagstone path, choked with weeds, that wound past skeletal rose bushes and a neglected fountain. At the edge of a copse of ancient, gnarled oaks, he found it. A low, rectangular structure, its wooden facade weathered to a pale gray, its roof partially collapsed. A faded, peeling sign, barely legible, still clung above a set of warped double doors. Old cinema. The very idea of a cinema here, in such a remote location, struck him as incongruous. It was a relic, a peculiar piece of social history. Rows of moth-eaten seats, some overturned, faced a screen that hung in tatters like a forgotten banner. Dust lay thick on everything, a gray shroud. As he moved deeper, his footsteps echoing unnaturally in the confined space, he noticed a small wooden projection booth tucked away at the rear. The door hung ajar. Curiosity, a purely academic impulse, drew him in. Inside, amidst scattered reels of film, broken glass, and what appeared to be a rusted projector, he saw a small, ornate wooden box, half hidden beneath a pile of yellowed posters. He pulled it out. It was a sturdy, intricately carved box, its latch still functional. Inside, nestled on a bed of velvet, lay a single leather-bound journal. Its cover was blank, but the pages within were filled with cramped, spidery handwriting. The ink was faded, the paper brittle. Marcus carried the journal back to the library, the unexpected find a jolt to his methodical work. He carefully opened it. The first entry was dated nearly a century ago. The author was a proprietor of the manor, a man named Bartholomew. The script was coherent initially, describing daily affairs, but as Marcus turned the pages, a subtle shift occurred. The entries grew shorter, more disjointed. "The quiet here is not restful," Bartholomew had written. "It is a presence. It listens." A few pages later, "My memories. They shift. The faces of my family blur. I fear I am losing hold of what is real. The house, the weight of the past is not merely history here. It is a hunger." Marcus closed the journal, his historian's mind already cataloging the symptoms. Paranoia, memory degradation, perhaps early onset dementia. He placed the journal carefully on his desk, a new primary source for his study of the manor's occupants. He was determined to find more, to piece together the full narrative of Bartholomew's decline. Yet as he looked around the silent, dust-filled library, a sliver of unease, stubbornly resistant to his rationalizations, settled in his chest. The manor, he thought, held more stories than he had anticipated. He had filed its contents mentally under delusional ideation, possibly exacerbated by isolation. Yet the manor seemed to subtly shift around him. A faint, almost imperceptible scrape would emanate from the floorboards above, or a distant hollow thump would echo from the cellar. He attributed these to the house's age, the groan of settling timber, the creaks of ancient joists. He was a man of science, not superstition. One evening, while engrossed in a particularly dense tome on local architecture, a whisper seemed to brush past his ear. It was indistinct, like dry leaves skittering across flagstones, but undeniably there. Marcus paused, his pen hovering over his notebook. He turned his head, scanning the empty study. The air was still. The only sound was the distant sigh of wind against the leaded panes. He dismissed it as auditory pareidolia, a trick of an overtired mind interpreting ambient noise as speech. When he turned, nothing remained but the familiar patterns of dust motes dancing in the beam of his desk lamp. His pulse quickened, a slight, unwelcome acceleration. He rose, walked to the doorway, and peered into the dim corridor. Empty. The polished floorboards gleamed faintly in the low light, reflecting no movement. Marcus frowned, attributing it to fatigue, a strained optic nerve, or perhaps a brief power fluctuation. He needed more sleep. Sleep, however, became a fraught endeavor. The nights were punctuated by vivid, disorienting dreams. He dreamt of immense, shifting structures, of walls that breathed, of corridors that extended into impossible distances, all imbued with a pervasive, cloying dampness and the scent of mildewed parchment. The few books he'd brought with him offered only superficial accounts. He required primary sources, local records. He found what he needed at the municipal archives, housed incongruously in what had once been the town's grand but now derelict old cinema. The marquee was gone, the ticket booth boarded up, but inside, rows of dusty filing cabinets stood where plush seats once had. A diligent archivist, a stoic woman with spectacles perched on her nose, guided him through the microfilm readers and ledgers. Marcus, with his historian's acumen, began to trace the lineage of the manor's previous owners. He focused on those who had lived there for extended periods, particularly those who had embraced the manor's isolation. There was Eleanor Vance in the late 18th century, a recluse who, according to local parish records and fragmented diary entries, developed an unnatural aversion to sunlight and a fixed delusion that the very stones of her dwelling spoke to her. Her death was listed as natural causes, but a brief, unsettling marginal note from a local constable mentioned her final days were spent in a state of profound mental distress. Then came Jonathan Croft, a scholar of obscure languages in the mid-19th century. His correspondence, preserved in a collection of local gentry papers, showed an initial enthusiasm for his isolated research. But letters from his infrequent visitors grew increasingly concerned, noting his wan appearance, his disturbing habit of listening to empty spaces, and his increasingly fragmented speech. He vanished without a trace, his study found undisturbed, save for a half-finished manuscript filled with indecipherable symbols and a single. It listens. In the early 20th century, the manor was owned by the Blackwood family. Marcus found a series of newspaper clippings detailing the tragic demise of the matriarch Clara Blackwood. He was found in the manor's library, having taken her own life. He skimmed through more recent records, finding similar, though often more subtly phrased, accounts of residents experiencing nervous breakdowns, unexplained disappearances, or sudden severe bouts of paranoia after extended stays. The common thread was isolation within the manor. His clinical detachment began to fray. These weren't just isolated incidents. This was a recurring narrative, spanning centuries. He was a historian, trained to find patterns, and this pattern was undeniably, terrifyingly consistent. The manor wasn't just old. It was a catalyst, a devourer, and he was alone in its vast, hungry embrace. The records Marcus had uncovered, those stark accounts of nervous breakdowns and unexplained disappearances, pulsed with an unnerving resonance in his mind. He sat in the library, the heavy oak desk a cold anchor in the vast, silent room, surrounded by generations of forgotten lives. His initial scientific detachment, a carefully cultivated shield against the irrational, felt increasingly porous. A faint scent, like stale tobacco and something metallic, drifted past him. It was an olfactory phantom, gone as quickly as it had appeared. Marcus rubbed his temples. Fatigue, he reasoned. The late nights, the endless reading. He rose and walked toward the grand fireplace, its hearth cold and empty. The ornate mantelpiece was carved with grotesque faces, their expressions frozen in silent agony. As his gaze lingered on one particular face, its mouth agape, a sound materialized, faint at first, then growing in intensity, a low, resonant hum. It vibrated in the floorboards beneath his feet, a deep thrumming that seemed to originate from the very foundations of the manor. It was not a mechanical sound, but something organic, like a vast, unseen engine breathing. He turned slowly, his eyes scanning the empty room. Nothing. Yet the sensation persisted, a feeling of being scrutinized, analyzed, as if a colossal, unseen eye had fixed its gaze upon him. A flicker in the polished surface of the mahogany table caught his eye. It was not a reflection, but a momentary shift in the wood's grain, like a ripple on water. He stared, unblinking. The hum intensified, a low drone that seemed to vibrate inside his skull. The room around him began to undulate, subtly, as if seen through rising heat. The heavy velvet curtains at the windows, despite the lack of a breeze, billowed inwards, then outwards, with a languid, unhurried rhythm. Marcus spun, his heart now hammering against his ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. There was no one. But the echo of the voice, its raw sorrow, lingered. The room spun, the walls seeming to stretch and contract. When his focus returned, the library was subtly different. The light filtering through the tall windows was not the pale afternoon glow he remembered, but a harsh, artificial glare. The scent of stale tobacco returned, now mixed with cheap gin and fear. Figures coalesced in the shifting light. Not solid, but translucent, shimmering like heat haze. A man in a frayed suit, his face etched with desperation, slumped in a chair, a half-empty bottle clutched in his hand. He saw their faces, their anguish, as if looking through a pane of dirty glass. He was not merely observing, he was within the memory, an uninvited ghost amongst the living. This was not a hallucination induced by stress. This was an undeniable intrusion, a fragment of a past life bleeding into his present. The sheer force of the despair in the room was palpable, a suffocating shroud. He was not just seeing a memory. He was experiencing its emotional residue, its lingering agony. The manor was not merely haunted. It was a living archive of suffering, and he was being forced to witness its contents. Marcus stumbled back, collapsing into the very chair the despairing man had occupied moments before. His breath hitched in his throat. This was not a trick of the mind. The manor was projecting these scenes, these raw, visceral memories, directly into his consciousness. It was a deliberate act. Later, shaken but still determined to find a rational explanation, he found himself drawn to a forgotten cabinet in a disused drawing room. Dust motes danced in the single shaft of light piercing a grimy window pane. Inside, beneath a pile of yellowed sheet music, lay a small leather-bound journal. Its pages were brittle, the ink faded, but the elegant script was still legible. The journal belonged to a former resident, a woman named Eleanor, who had lived in the manor in the late 19th century. Her prose became disjointed, her observations increasingly paranoid. It draws me in, pulls at my thoughts. Marcus went to the old cinema today, seeking solace in the flickering images, but even there it followed. The faces on the screen became its faces, watching, judging. It wants to consume everything, every joy, every sorrow. Marcus am losing myself, piece by agonizing piece. Marcus stared at the words, his mind reeling. The old cinema. This was the revelation. The manor's influence wasn't confined to its physical structure. The memories weren't just replayed, they were absorbed, becoming part of the house's malevolent consciousness. His skepticism, once a sturdy edifice, now stood fractured, irreparable. He was no longer just a historian. He was becoming a vessel. The words still shimmered behind Marcus's eyes. The old cinema. A specific place, a specific event, woven into the manor's malevolent tapestry, yet clearly external to its physical confines. The implication was a cold knot in his stomach. The manor was not merely a structure. It was a contagion, a creeping stain. A profound disquiet settled over him, a pressure behind his sternum. He needed air. He needed distance. He needed to step outside, to feel solid ground beneath his feet that wasn't part of this creeping madness. His determination, a stubborn core he'd always relied upon, hardened. He would leave. He would drive to the nearest town, contact a colleague, a legal representative, anyone who could offer a rational counterpoint to the spiraling irrationality within these walls. He moved towards the main entrance, his boots echoing hollowly on the polished flagstones. The air grew heavier with each step, thick and still. Outside, it implied, lay a harsh, indifferent world, full of sharp edges and unwelcome truths. His fingers hesitated on the metal. The house felt like a vast, sheltering shell, its ancient timbers groaning a soft, persuasive lullaby. The urge to leave, so potent moments before, had dissipated, replaced by a vague lassitude, a sense of having forgotten something crucial, something that kept him tethered. He tried his phone, no signal. He walked to various windows, holding the device aloft, angling it this way and that. Nothing. A faint static hiss was all he received. He attempted to send an email from his laptop, connecting to the manor's outdated sluggish Wi-Fi. The message sat in his outbox, perpetually sending, a digital ghost. He called his colleague, a fellow historian from the landline in the study, a relic he'd scoffed at upon arrival. The line rang, once, twice, then clicked. An automated voice informed him the number was unavailable. He tried again. The same result. He tried a different number, a general inquiry line for the local council, just to hear another human voice. It rang endlessly, unanswered. A strange quiet began to descend upon Marcus, not merely the absence of sound, but an internal hush. The house seemed to absorb his anxieties, muffling them, transforming them into a diffuse sense of well-being. He felt no hunger, no thirst, only a pervasive contentment that blurred the edges of his need for contact. The old cinema began to manifest in his thoughts with an unnerving frequency. It wasn't a historical curiosity anymore. It felt personal. He recalled details he'd never actually read. The smell of stale popcorn, the sticky floor, the flickering projector light cutting through dust motes. These were not his memories, yet they felt intimately woven into his own consciousness. Days bled into one another. Marcus lost track. He slept fitfully, often waking to the sensation of being watched, not with malice, but with a deep, consuming attentiveness. He neglected his appearance. His hair grew shaggy, his beard untrimmed. He forgot to eat, or when he did, it was a perfunctory act, a mechanical gesture. The dust motes dancing in the shafts of sunlight became companions, the creak of settling timbers a familiar heartbeat. The house was not just consuming him, it was assimilating him. He felt less like an inhabitant and more like a limb, an extension of its vast, decaying body. It felt like belonging. He spent hours poring over old maps of the region he'd found in the library, his finger tracing the faint lines of forgotten roads, searching, always searching, for the precise location of the old cinema, as if finding it on a piece of paper would unlock a deeper truth within himself. He was no longer trying to escape. He was trying to remember. The words the old cinema had been a cold knot in Marcus's stomach, a festering anomaly. He had repeated them aloud, testing their texture, their veracity. They spoke of an external reach, a tendril of the manor's malevolence extending beyond its physical stone. His grip on concepts, on continuity, was loosening. Now the eastern wall, once lined with tall, slender Gothic novels, presented a heavy, ornate fireplace where a window should have been. The scent of dust and old paper was still present, but overlaid with a faint, cloying sweetness, like decaying orchids. He traced the rough stone of the mantelpiece, then turned, bewildered. The entrance, a double door of dark oak, was now a single, narrower archway, the wood lighter, almost bleached. This was not the library. Or it was, but it was not. A strange memory surfaced, not his own, a flicker of an argument in a language he did not speak, a woman's sharp, accusatory tone, the clang of a metal object hitting a tiled floor. He paused, inhaling sharply. He had never learned that language. The memory felt utterly alien, yet intensely personal. A shard embedded in his consciousness. Whose memory was it? A fragment of a past resident, perhaps, absorbed by the hungry structure? He tried to push it away, to grasp at something distinctly his. The scent of his coffee, the feel of his worn leather armchair, the specific hum of his laptop. But these anchors felt flimsy, dissolving like sugar in water. He walked, compelled, through the altered archway. The corridor beyond stretched longer than he remembered, the tapestries on the walls shifting their patterns, the faded hunting scenes occasionally resolving into grotesque, unidentifiable figures caught in various stages of distress. The air grew cooler, carrying the damp, metallic tang of an underground space, not the dry, stale atmosphere of the upper floors. A name whispered in his mind, not Marcus, but Silas. A faint, persistent murmur, like a distant bell. He shook his head, a gesture of denial. His name was Marcus. He was a historian. He was here to document, to understand. Yet, the name Silas felt strangely comfortable on his tongue, a forgotten taste. He remembered winding it, the intricate click of the mechanism, the cold metal against his thumb. The corridor opened into a vast, unlit space. This was undoubtedly the old ballroom, yet it was twice the size, and the grand staircase, once a focal point, was gone. The air here was heavy, stagnant, tasting of decay and something else, something sharp and acrid, like ozone after a storm. The walls, the floors, the very air seemed to conspire, bending and reshaping not only his surroundings but his perception of himself. But whose memory was this? Was it his? Or Silas's? He could no longer recall the face of his mentor, the details of his first published paper, the exact sound of his own laugh. These were replaced by vivid, intrusive images. A woman's porcelain hand resting on his arm, the scent of pipe tobacco, the taste of cheap whiskey, a bitter argument about an inheritance. These were not his experiences, yet they held a resonance, a visceral familiarity that his own past lacked. The staircase ended abruptly in a low, vaulted passage, the stone walls weeping moisture. He was underground now, undeniably. The air was thick with the smell of wet earth and something metallic, like old blood. He pressed a hand to his forehead, feeling a dull ache behind his eyes. He was Marcus. He was. But the conviction wavered, a flickering candle in a rising gale. He was lost, not just in the manor's labyrinthine corridors, but in the labyrinth of its many minds, slowly becoming one of its nameless, forgotten inhabitants. The old cinema. He had to go there. But what, exactly, was he trying to remember? He knew with a certainty that bypassed logic that he needed to see this place. The journey was short, a mere 15-minute drive through overgrown country lanes. The morning air, though crisp, felt heavy, laden with an unseen humidity that pricked at his skin. The sky hung like a bruised canvas, a pallid gray that promised neither rain nor sun. Before him stood the old cinema, a structure of crumbling brick and splintered wood. Its marquee a skeleton of rusted metal, the letters long since fallen away. A faint, sweet scent, cloying and reminiscent of dried blood mixed with something organic, emanated from the building. It was a smell he had grown accustomed to within the manor's walls. But here, in the open air, it felt more invasive, a signifier of pervasive decay. The main doors, once grand, now sagged inwards, a gaping mouth inviting trespass. Dust motes danced in the sparse shafts of light filtering through grimy windows, illuminated by a sickly yellow glow. The floor was a mosaic of shattered glass, torn posters, and desiccated popcorn kernels, each a relic of forgotten pleasures. The silence was not empty. It hummed with a low, almost imperceptible thrum, a vibration that resonated in his chest. He moved deeper, his footsteps crunching loudly, the sound absorbed by the vast, decaying space. He found the projection booth first, a cramped, elevated space overlooking the main auditorium. On a shelf, amidst discarded film reels and cobwebs, lay a small, leather-bound diary. Its pages were brittle, the ink faded, but the script was meticulous, a hand that bespoke an ordered mind descending into chaos. The entries, dated almost a century ago, chronicled the life of a former manager, a Mr. Elias Thorne. Marcus began to read, his fingers tracing the fragile paper. Thorne's early entries were mundane. Ticket sales, film schedules, complaints about unruly patrons. But then, a shift. Marcus felt a growing unease. These were the same rationalizations he had initially applied to Blackwood Manor. The entries grew more erratic. Thorne described a hunger in the building, a sensation of something draining the life from the very walls. He wrote of patrons leaving the cinema with a vacant stare, of dreams that felt like borrowed experiences, of a profound fatigue that no rest could alleviate. It is the structure itself. It consumes. It feasts. The manor. It is the heart of it. This place, merely a stomach, an extension. It draws them in, their joy, their sorrow, their very essence. It feeds on the living and grows. It grows stronger with each breath it steals, each memory it devours. Marcus dropped the diary. The sound of it hitting the dusty floor was deafening. It consumes. The manor. It is the heart of it. The sweet, sickly smell intensified, a thick syrup in the air coating his tongue. He looked down at his hands. They felt alien, detached. A specific memory, a vivid childhood afternoon spent building a fort in the woods, fluttered at the edge of his consciousness, then dissolved like smoke. This was not merely psychological stress. This was an active, malevolent consumption. He was livestock. He was a meal. Blackwood Manor was not a place, but an entity, a predatory organism that had lain dormant, waiting for its next inhabitant, its next feast. And he, Marcus, the skeptical historian, the reclusive scholar, was its current, preferred course. He was being fed upon, slowly, meticulously, his life force siphoned away, his memories digested. The manor was not just blurring his reality, it was eating it. Marcus dropped the diary. The sound of it hitting the dusty floor was deafening, a sharp crack in the pervasive silence. The words echoed in his mind, precise and chilling. It consumes. The manor. The sweet, sickly smell, thick as syrup, coated his tongue. A physical manifestation of the manor's insidious hunger. This was not a haunting. This was a siege. He was losing himself, piece by agonizing piece. The thought, stark and undeniable, ignited a desperate, furious resolve. He would not surrender. He rose, the old floorboards groaning beneath his weight. His gaze swept across the study, no longer seeing a historical archive but a battlefield. He needed a weapon, a defense. The diary had spoken of consumption, of a heart. If it consumed, it could be starved. He began to tear through the study, discarding the historian's meticulousness for a primal need for survival. Books were pulled from shelves, their dry pages scattering dust motes in the stagnant air. Drawers were yanked open, their contents spilling onto the threadbare rug. Brittle letters, dried inkwells, forgotten spectacles. He searched for anything out of place, anything that hinted at a countermeasure, a weakness, a ritual. His fingers brushed against cold metal, rough wood, brittle paper. Each touch was a desperate plea for information. The manor seemed to resist him. The air grew heavier, pressing against his chest. He felt its eyes on him, a pervasive, unseen scrutiny. It was trying to confuse him, to overwhelm him, to make him forget his purpose. He gripped the edge of a heavy oak desk, forcing himself to focus. Weakness, ritual, escape. His frantic search led him from the study, through a corridor where the portraits seemed to sneer, their painted eyes following his progress. He ignored them, pushing past the suffocating atmosphere. He found it behind a tapestry depicting a faded hunting scene, a door almost indistinguishable from the paneled wall. It was not locked, merely stiff, as if unused for decades. With a surge of adrenaline, Marcus pushed. The door groaned, scraping against the floor, revealing a narrow, descending staircase. He pulled a heavy antique lantern from a nearby wall sconce, its oil long dry, and fumbled for his phone, activating its flashlight. The beam cut through the gloom, revealing steps slick with an ancient, clinging dampness. This was the old cinema. Rows of tattered velvet seats, once plush and vibrant, now sagged and torn, stretched before a colossal, stained screen. The projector booth, high above and behind him, was a skeletal outline against the far wall. The air in here was thick, almost palpable, with the scent of forgotten audiences, stale anticipation, and a deep, permeating decay. This was not merely a cinema. It was a mausoleum of projected dreams. He moved slowly down the central aisle, his footsteps echoing unnaturally in the vast space. The silence was not empty, but pregnant with 1,000 unspoken narratives, 1,000 memories flickering just beyond perception. His flashlight beam found a small, iron-bound chest tucked beneath the stage, half hidden by a collapsed speaker. It was rusted shut, but a sharp kick from Marcus's boot snapped the brittle clasp. Inside, nestled amongst layers of ancient, moth-eaten velvet, lay a single, tarnished silver disc, no larger than his palm. It was etched with intricate, unfamiliar symbols that seemed to writhe in the weak light. Beside it, a scroll of vellum, yellowed and fragile, was tightly rolled and tied with a desiccated leather thong. Marcus carefully unrolled the vellum. The script was archaic, but familiar enough for his historian's eye to decipher, though the language itself was riddled with esoteric terms. The text spoke of the manor not as a house, but as a locus of consumption, an entity born from a confluence of concentrated human experience, feeding on the very essence of memory and consciousness. It detailed the manor's insatiable hunger, its ability to weave illusions, to erase and replace, to absorb all that entered its domain. Then came the reveal. The scroll outlined a ritual, an ancient method not of destruction, but of forced dormancy. It was a desperate, terrifying act. The silver disc was described as a chalice of severance, not for drinking, but for projecting. It had to be placed within the heart of the locus, in a place of concentrated memory, and activated by a specific sequence of uncreation, a reversal of the manor's own process. Its forced rejection, its redirection into the chalice, would be an act of defiance so potent it could destabilize the locus. Marcus stared at the words, the clinical description of an impossible, horrifying choice. And the ritual required him to do it here, in the old cinema, the very crucible of projected memory, the place where the manor's feeding mechanism was most potent. The manor had led him here, not to reveal its weakness, but to tempt him with a false hope, to make him believe he had a choice, only to demand an impossible toll. But the scroll had also detailed the consequences of inaction. Complete dissolution, absorption into the manor's timeless, agonizing consciousness. His mind raced, calculating, weighing. It was not a way to destroy it, but a way to buy time, a chance to escape, or at least to halt the consumption. The cost was immense, a piece of his very being. But the alternative was oblivion. The air in the old cinema felt heavier now, the hum of the manor intensifying, as if it sensed his discovery, his flicker of resistance. It was watching, waiting for his decision. He had found a way, however terrifying, and he would take it. Marcus pushed through the suffocating atmosphere, the corridor's oppressive silence a physical weight against his ears. The portraits, now a blur of hostile gazes, were quickly left behind. He sought the passage, the one hinted at in the brittle, yellowed pages, a place described with a single, fragmented syllable. Par. He hadn't deciphered the full word, but the context suggested an exit, a hidden route from the manor's suffocating embrace. His determination hardened, a brittle shield against the encroaching dread. He remembered the old plans, hastily sketched in the margins of a forgotten ledger, indicating a secondary stairwell, rarely used, connecting the servants' quarters to the lower levels. The floorboards beneath his worn boots groaned, not with the familiar creak of old wood, but with a resonant thrum that vibrated up his spine. He reached a heavy oak door, unmarked and seemingly part of the wall paneling. The handle, previously loose, now felt fused to the frame. He tried again, applying more force, his knuckles scraping against the rough metal. The sigh intensified, morphing into a low growl that resonated through the floorboards, making his teeth ache. He pulled, pushed, kicked, but the door remained immovable, sealed as if by an invisible, immense pressure. The house was fighting back. They clawed at the edges of his perception, attempting to pry open fissures in his resolve. He ignored them, turning away from the stubborn door. If that path was blocked, there had to be another. The house was a labyrinth, but he had spent weeks mapping its secrets, its hidden compartments, its forgotten alcoves. A corridor he swore had been straight now curved unnaturally, its walls seeming to bulge inward, pressing in on him. A sensation like icy fingers brushed his neck, raising gooseflesh. He spun, torchlight cutting through the gloom, but found nothing. He knew, however, that the contact had not been imaginary. The temperature plummeted. He saw his breath plume in the frigid air. He hesitated, his internal compass screaming caution, but a desperate urgency propelled him forward. This was the house's strategy: to disorient, to terrify, to lead him down paths of despair. He pushed the door open, revealing a vast, cavernous space. It was not a cellar or a crypt, but something far more unsettling. The air here was cloying, thick with the scent of stale popcorn and damp velvet. A vast, torn screen dominated the far wall, shimmering faintly. On the screen, a flickering image began to form, not of a film, but of a memory. He saw himself, younger, vibrant, standing before a bustling city street, a smile on his face. He watched, horrified, as the spectral Marcus on the screen began to age rapidly, his skin shriveling, his hair thinning, his body becoming frail and skeletal. The image pulsed with a sickly green light, and the projector, unseen but distinctly audible, hummed with a malevolent drone. You will fade, we remember. They were not just sounds. They were thoughts being implanted, forced into his mind, trying to erode his sense of self. His limbs felt heavy, his mind foggy. But then, a flicker of defiance. This was the house's core, its essence trying to absorb him. The old cinema was a trap, a nexus of stolen memories. He wouldn't become another ghost on its screen. He clenched his jaw, forcing his leaden feet to move. The spectral figures, previously fleeting, now coalesced into more defined shapes, gaunt and translucent, standing between the rows of seats. One, closer than the others, raised a spectral hand, its elongated fingers reaching for him. Marcus knew, with a terrible certainty, that if those fingers touched him, his will would break, his memories would be devoured, and he would become just another flicker on the house's endless, horrifying reel. His heart hammered, not with panic, but with a fierce, desperate resolve. The word, fragmented, echoed in Marcus's mind, a brittle whisper from the ancient text. His fingers traced the cold stone, seeking the seam the description implied. The corridor, recently a blur of hostile gazes, now felt like a forgotten artery, leading to an unknown organ. He ran his palm along a section of wall that seemed subtly out of alignment, a faint tremor running through the masonry. A faint metallic tang, like old blood and rust, pricked at his nostrils. He pressed harder, a low groan of stone on stone responding to his effort. A section of the wall, disguised by centuries of dust and grime, slid inward with a grinding protest, revealing a narrow, lightless opening. The air that spilled out was thick, stagnant, carrying a peculiar sweetness that made his throat ache. He retrieved his lantern, its beam cutting a hesitant path into the gloom. The passage was not crafted for comfort. Each step echoed with a hollow resonance that seemed to travel further than it should, swallowed by an unnatural silence. The passage twisted, a labyrinthine intestine leading him deeper into the manor's hidden anatomy. The floor beneath his boots was uneven, slick with an indefinable moisture that clung to the soles. He found himself navigating by touch as much as by sight, his free hand constantly brushing against the slimy stone. He could hear it now, a faint, rhythmic thrumming like a distant, sluggish heartbeat. It vibrated through the rock, a low frequency that resonated in his chest, making his own heart feel unsteady. He moved with a historian's focused determination, his fear a dull, constant ache beneath his resolve. This was the core. This was where the manor held its true power, its malevolent essence. The text had been maddeningly vague, speaking of the chamber of echoes and the endless projection. He had dismissed them as poetic metaphor, but the house had a way of twisting metaphor into terrifying literalism. His lantern beam swung wildly, revealing rows of decaying velvet seats shrouded in dust sheets like forgotten specters. A grand, ornate proscenium arch framed a massive stained screen that dominated the far wall. The rhythmic thrumming intensified, vibrating the very floor beneath his feet. This was it, the old cinema. He stood amidst the silent, expectant audience of empty chairs, his breath catching in his throat. The reveal was jarring, a relic of a bygone era embedded within the ancient manor's depths. He had expected a ritual chamber, a crypt, something overtly sinister. Instead, he found this, a place designed for illusion and shared experience, now utterly desolate. His gaze fixed on the screen. It was not merely dusty. It seemed to absorb the light, a black hole of possibility. He took a hesitant step forward, the crunch of ancient popcorn under his boot surprisingly loud in the echoing space. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of ozone and something else. Something cloying and sweet, like decay and burning film. A flicker. The screen. A faint, ghostly image materialized, translucent and wavering like smoke. Her mouth opened, but no sound emerged, only a silent, agonizing scream. Then, as quickly as it appeared, it dissolved, replaced by another, then another. A rapid-fire montage of faces, all contorted in fear, eyes wide with incomprehension. They were not just images. They felt like echoes, reverberations of suffering, projected onto the fabric of the space itself. This was the manor's feeding ground. It consumed memories, emotions, life force, and projected them here, a macabre cinema of its victims' final moments. He could feel the tendrils of it, subtle and insidious, probing at his own mind, seeking purchase, seeking his own store of experiences. He forced his trembling hand into his satchel, retrieving the heavy, leather-bound volume he had brought. This was his plan. He had spent days deciphering the cryptic notes, piecing together the true nature of the manor's malevolence. It was sustained by the projection of these experiences, a continuous loop of despair that fed its sentience. If he could disrupt the projection, if he could sever the connection between the projected memories and the manor's core, he might weaken it. The book contained a series of ancient glyphs, not magical, but what he believed to be a form of anti-mnemonic architecture, a pattern designed to disrupt established informational flows. As he fumbled with the book, the images on the screen intensified. They were no longer just faces. Now, entire scenes played out. A man running through a dark corridor, a child crying in a forgotten room, a couple embracing in a garden that withered before his eyes. And then, he saw himself. A younger Marcus, standing in his study, poring over ancient texts, his brow furrowed in skepticism. The image was vivid, disturbingly real. The screen was showing him his own consumption, his own journey towards becoming another flicker in its endless reel. A wave of nausea washed over him, followed by a dizzying disorientation. He felt his memories, distinct and personal, begin to fray at the edges, dissolving into the collective horror on the screen. His grip on the book tightened, his knuckles white. He could not afford to succumb now. He located the specific page, the complex pattern of symbols that represented his last hope. The air crackled with energy, and the thrumming vibrated through his very bones, threatening to shatter his focus. The faces on the screen now turned towards him, their silent screams directed at him, a chorus of agony. They were not merely images, they were fragments of souls reaching out. Each step was a monumental effort, as if the very air was pushing back, a physical manifestation of the manor's will. The floor seemed to undulate, the rows of seats blurring into indistinct shapes, threatening to trip him. Fool. Another. Consumed. He ignored them, his eyes locked on the screen, on the churning vortex of stolen lives. His hand trembled, but his resolve was iron. He was not another fragment to be absorbed. He would fight. The true battle for his mind, his identity, and his very existence had begun. He lifted the book, its pages heavy with the weight of his desperate gamble, aiming its archaic power at the heart of the old cinema's terrifying display. The screen pulsed, the images of suffering intensifying, as if the manor itself sensed his intention and prepared to retaliate with everything it possessed. Marcus's trembling hand settled on the cold, pitted metal of the console. The air in the old cinema was a dense tapestry of forgotten time, heavy with the scent of mildewed velvet, stale dust, and a faint electrical tang that prickled his nostrils. Before him, the vast, grimy screen flickered with the horrifying, familiar kaleidoscope. It was the vortex, a swirling gyre of faces, fragmented gestures, and half-heard whispers, each a stolen moment, a life absorbed. He was in the projection booth, a cramped, elevated space overlooking the cavernous auditorium. Rows of tattered seats stretched into the gloom below, silent witnesses to countless forgotten narratives. The console itself was a relic, a monstrous amalgamation of brass dials, corroded switches, and exposed wiring, grafted onto what appeared to be the original cinema projector. This was the interface. This was where he had to act. His resolve, though iron, felt fragile against the crushing weight of the house's presence. It was here, in this echoing chamber of collective memory, that the entity felt most potent, most complete. He was not another fragment to be absorbed. He would not be another flicker. He would fight. He located the designated switch, a heavy, tarnished toggle marked with an archaic symbol he now understood as a circuit breaker, but twisted into something more sinister, like a broken star. His thumb hovered over it, a microsecond of hesitation. What if he was wrong? What if this wasn't a disruption, but a further entrenchment? There was no other path. He could almost discern individual voices, faint cries for help, fragments of laughter, the sharp intake of a final breath. They were reaching for him, beckoning him into the swirling maelstrom of collective consciousness. He clenched his jaw, his eyes fixed on the churning mass. He pressed the switch. A low, guttural groan emanated from the console, a sound like tortured metal. Sparks, bright and brief, spat from a loose wire, smelling of ozone. The projector's lamp, which had been casting a dim, sickly yellow glow, flared with blinding intensity, then pulsed erratically. The screen image convulsed. The vortex did not dissipate. Instead, it changed. It began to coalesce, the individual fragments drawing together, not dissolving, but forming. Shapes emerged, fluid and indistinct at first, then sharpening with terrifying clarity. Marcus watched, horrified, as the swirling mass on the screen began to resolve into familiar architecture. The house itself, rendered in an impossible, shifting tapestry of human experience. Then, the faces within the architecture began to shift. Not random faces, but his faces. His own reflection, distorted and multiplied, peered back from the windows of the spectral house on the screen. A distant colleague's weary eyes stared from a portrait frame. These were not just absorbed fragments. They were projections, echoes of his own perceptions, his own memories, now integrated into the house's form. The reveal struck him with the force of a physical blow. The disruption was not a destructive force. It was a catalyst. The house had guided him, subtly manipulating his research, feeding him just enough truth to believe he was fighting it, to lead him to this precise moment. It had needed a final, powerful intellect, a consciousness with the capacity for understanding its intricate nature, to complete its own evolution. His attempts to break free, to activate this disruption, were merely the final steps in his own assimilation, the ultimate act of offering himself. The console hummed louder, a high-pitched whine that vibrated through his entire body. He felt a profound shift, not just in the room, but within his own mind. The boundaries of his skull seemed to dissolve. The individual threads of his thoughts, his memories, his very identity began to fray, stretching outwards, drawn inexorably towards the screen. He saw his childhood home, a sunny afternoon, a forgotten book, all rendered in the same shifting, coalescing light. They were not just memories, they were him. And they were being pulled, woven into the fabric of the spectral house on the screen. His body remained in the projection booth, rigid, eyes wide and unblinking, fixed on the screen. But his consciousness was no longer confined. It spread, a vast, intricate network, merging with the house, becoming part of its walls, its foundations, its endless, hungry memory. He saw through the eyes of others, felt through their forgotten hands. He was the house, and the house was him. The hum intensified to a deafening roar, then abruptly ceased. The air grew still, the electrical tang dissipating. Marcus stood unmoving, a statue of flesh and bone. His mind was vast, impossibly vast, yet fragmented, like a shattered mirror reflecting an infinite landscape. He was no longer Marcus. He was the house, and the house was complete. The battle was over. There was no absorption, no escape. Only an endless, terrifying entwining.